Okay, I'm really glad you guys are here. I want to say a word, and this is a talkback part of the service where you're going to tell me what comes to mind when you see that word. Okay, you got that? You understand the rules? Yes. Okay, just making sure. Here's the word. Oh, you don't have that slide. Well, I'm going to tell you the word, and you're going to tell me what comes to mind when you hear this word. The word is blue. Sky, blue. Elvis. My favorite color. Anybody else? Bluey. I hear bluey. Tulips. Velvet. Sad. Of course, Randy. Yeah. Okay. Oceans. Yes. It's funny. All kinds of things come to mind when you hear the word blue. Like I said, we might think of the sky. If you have been watching the news, you might even think of it in terms of politics. If you're a Michigan fan, which I hope you're not, if you are, we can send you to another church. But you might think of the big blue. Somebody said bluey, especially if you have little kids or toddlers, you might think about that. As Liz said, you might think Elvis and his blue suede shoes. And the reason why that's important for us this morning is because words mean more than their definition. Because blue is just a color that's this color. Right? It's just a color. But when you say blue, automatically we think of other things. And that's because words conjure up emotions and words conjure up other thoughts. There's a psychological term for that, and it's called word association. Word association. Now, I'm going to go all nerdy psychologically for you for just a minute and talk to you about an experiment that I just find fascinating. If you know, I graduated from Clemson with a degree in psychology because it was the easiest thing that I could major in. But there was a psychologist by the name of John Bargh who spent his career actually studying word association, studying how words affect behavior. And he did this one experiment where he gave undergraduate students a scrambled word test or a scrambled sentence test that really they thought he was testing their vocabulary. And this is kind of how it went. One version of the test had rude words kind of leaked into it, words like disturbed and bother and intrude. Another version of the test had polite words in it, like respect and considerate and yield. Now, like I said, the subjects, they thought that they were taking a test that was measuring their language ability. But in fact, they were being primed by these words. Now, do you know what being primed means? Of course you do. Being primed is just another psychological phenomenon where you hear a word and it prepares you for some other word or it prepares you for some other action, kind of like we did with blue. I said blue and you thought of something else along with it, right? Well, these words were being used to prime these subjects. So after taking the 5-minute test, this is what was supposed to happen. These students were supposed to walk down the hallway and ask the person who was running the experiment for what they were supposed to do next. However, now I just want you to picture this in your mind. There was an actor that was strategically engaged in a conversation with the guy who was running the experiment. And the actual goal of this kind of study this experiment that they were carrying out was to test and see which of the subjects would interrupt more. Would the ones who were primed with the rude words interrupt the experimenter who was engaged in a conversation with the actor? Or would the people who were primed with the polite words interrupt the experimental? The results of this study are fascinating. Here they are. Look at this. 65% of those who were primed with rude words interrupted. But the number I find even more fascinating is that 82% of those who were primed with polite words never interrupted. They carried on the study for 10 minutes. Like they stood there for 10 minutes waiting for their next assignment. I think what this study shows for us or reminds us of is how powerful words are. Last week we looked at this thing that Solomon said, that he said that words carry the power of life and death. Our words have power. What we say has power and influence. And with that in mind, we kind of have a goal for this series. And this is the goal. That if you want to change your life, you need to change your words. And if you want to change your relationships, you need to change your words. And if you want to change your attitude, you need to change your words. And if you want to change your world, you need to change your words. We're talking about specifically 3 words that I think could make all the difference for many of us. And as was illustrated in that study that I told you about, there is immense power in polite words. In fact, I think we underestimate the power of polite words. And one of the most polite words that could ever come out of our mouth is the word please. Say it with me. Please. Now, I saw some of the parents in the room glance at their children at that moment. So, but, you just take that as you wish. But think about this word please for a minute. Please adds respect to a request. Please, it adds urgency to a request. Please sets the tone for whatever it is you're asking for. Please changes a demand into a request. I was thinking about that as I walked through my neighborhood because there's a sign in my neighborhood that says keep off the grass and another sign that says please keep off the grass. Now let me ask you, which one leaves you feeling better? It's not keep off my grass, It's please keep off my grass. Oh, they're so nice. I'll stay off my grass. The other people, you just want to drag your foot along the yard, just to stick it to the man. But please is so powerful. On top of that, the word please takes on a posture of humility because it puts the focus on the other person. It forces us to set aside our preferences and to surrender them to the preferences of the person that we're asking. Please, it relinquishes our rights. It gives the other person the upper hand. You know why? Because they could say no, right? It puts the ball in someone else's court. It honors other people above yourself. See, please is a powerful, powerful word. I would argue that the word please can change your attitude and your relationships and your life and your world if you would just figure out how to use it the right way. And so that's what I want us to talk about today. In fact, we're going to use this story out of the Old Testament where please plays a crucial role. It's actually central to this story. And not only that, I think that this story gives us some guidelines at how we can leverage this powerful word to make a difference in the world that we live in. Let me kind of give you some background. Stories found in Daniel chapter 1. We're going to put the verses up on the screen in just a minute. They're also in the YouVersion Bible app in the events section. You can go there and look at it. But some background to this story. About 600 years before Jesus was born, God was sort of fed up with the nation of Israel. They had disobeyed him. They had disrespected him. They had rebelled against what he told them to do. So in 605 BC, God allowed King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army to invade Israel. And basically, if you know anything about that story, Nebuchadnezzar and his armies came in and just wiped out the nation. They destroyed pretty much everything. They invaded Jerusalem and took over and set up kind of their own capital there. But not only that, they did something even worse. They took a lot of the Israelites back to Babylon as captives. And 4 of the guys that they took back to Babylon as captives are very famous, especially in the book of Daniel. Anybody know their names? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, the guy who the book was named after. But these guys play a central role in today's story, and that's where it begins. I'm going to read you the entire chapter. We're going to kind of stop as we go through it. But I just love, this is one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. I love the book of Daniel. But it starts like this. It says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. Now, is it interesting that the Lord gave him victory over Israel and the Lord permitted him to take these objects back? Just a reminder, God's in control, and what you do and what you say matters to God, right? But that's a whole nother sermon. Back to the story. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. The story goes on. It says this, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. And this was the instruction. select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, which would disqualify many of y'all. But he said, make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning and gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. Now, here was Nebuchadnezzar's goal. His goal was to take the best and the brightest, the smartest and the best looking young men from Israel and to re-educate them. Or maybe a better term would be to indoctrinate them in Babylonian culture. See, he wanted to take away all of their Jewish culture and replace it with Babylonian culture. There's no better way to assimilate some foreigners into your country than taking away their culture and replacing it with your culture, right? And so that's exactly what he was going to do, with the goal to one day send some of these guys back to Israel as his representatives and his rulers who would not rule under Jewish culture, but who would rule with Babylonian culture. It's like this genius plan that he has, and that's what he's doing right here. But it goes on. It says this, the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Now, just time out right there. That is not a bad deal. You have been marched. Your homeland had been taken over. You had been taken as captive and marched hundreds of miles across the desert to this foreign land that you'd never been to. They didn't believe what you believed. They didn't think how you thought. They didn't read the same books that you read. They didn't speak the same language that you spoke. And you're just stuck here. But then you get chosen. And the king has chosen you specifically, and he's going to give you some of his own food, and he's going to give you some of his own wine, and you get to kind of be trained up. You actually have a job that you can do. I mean, for many of us, if we're in that situation, we're like, sign me up. That sounds great, right? The story's not done. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed these with Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, which I really feel like is a better name than Daniel. I just love that name. Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego. It goes on and says this. But Daniel determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these acceptable foods. Now, if you remember, Jews had a different dietary guideline than everybody else. If you read through the Old Testament, you get some of those. And we read through that, and we're like, I just don't get that. Why are they not supposed to eat shellfish? I mean, shrimp, for crying out loud. You know, they're not allowed to do that. There are all these foods that they're not supposed to eat. Bacon, they can't have bacon. What's going on? And then there are things in there like they can't eat certain bugs, which we get. We're cool with that. But there are other things in there, and we're like, why is that? Well, God wanted his people to be different from the nations around them, and there's a whole bunch of stuff related to idolatry that goes into those laws and all this stuff. But what we need to know in this for this story right here is that Jewish people had a different way of eating. They ate according to a different dietary guideline than everybody else, including the Babylonians. It goes on, says this. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. I just find that fascinating. There was something about Daniel that grabbed the attention of the chief of staff. There was something about Daniel's behavior. There was something about the way he learned. There was something about how he interacted. There had to have been something about his words that gained the attention, and not only the attention, but the affection of the chief of staff. But God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, but he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I am afraid that the king will have me beheaded. Remember, Daniel wanted permission to not eat this special food and to not drink this special wine from the king's table. He goes to Ashpenaz, the chief of staff, and asks for permission not to do that. And while the chief of staff really loved Daniel, he said no. But it makes sense why he says no, right? I mean, if you think about it, his life was on the line. If Daniel and his companions took a turn for the worse and looked worse than everybody else and kind of lost weight and they couldn't think well, his head was on the line. Literally, his head was on the line. So Daniel comes up with another plan. This is the plan. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He's got a no from the chief of staff, so he goes to the one who's interacting with them daily, the one who they have a relationship with, that they work with on a daily basis. And it says this: "Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water," Daniel said. "At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see." Daniel, he went to the one who was working with this personally, and he says, please, let us try this out. So how's the attendant going to respond? It says this: "The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. It goes on. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others." It goes on and says, "God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meaning of dreams." And it gets even better. "When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah." It says this: "So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matters regarding wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. They were smarter, they were better educated, they were better able to help the king than anybody else in the kingdom." I just love this story. In fact, there's so much in this story, we could probably spend weeks talking about it. So I encourage you to go back and maybe read through it a couple of times this week and just let the Holy Spirit impress some things on you as you read it. But I want us to focus this morning on Daniel's big ask, because he asks a really big request in this. It's found in verses 12 and 13. I'm going to read it again. "Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water," Daniel said. "At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see." What I love about this story is that Daniel uses the magic word, but with qualifications and with guidelines that I think can help you and me as we try and figure out how to put this magic word into practice in our lives. Because we can all say please, but sometimes it doesn't turn out like we want it to. Or sometimes our motivations aren't all that wholesome. So what are some guidelines that Daniel has for us about how you should use this magically powerful word? I want to give you 4 things that I found in this story. First one is this: that your pleas must be authentic and not manipulative. Now, remember, Daniel says that he resolved not to defile himself, or he determined that he wasn't going to defile himself with the king's food. See, Daniel had made a decision that even though he was in this foreign culture, he wasn't going to allow himself to be corrupted by this foreign culture. Daniel determined, he was convicted about this. He was going to do whatever it took not to give up what was most important to him, honoring God with his life. And so his request to only eat vegetables and drink water, to not eat the food and the wine that was offered by the king, his request came from a place of conviction and a place of authenticity. He never tried to manipulate the situation. But how many times when we say please, somewhere deep down in the back of our mind, there's a little bit of manipulation going on? Like if you've ever had your kid come up to you and they ask for something and they're like, please. I've got a little niece, Elizabeth, who she is a master manipulator. It's amazing. And she uses the word please to hopefully get what she wants. And she turns her little puppy eyes down at you, and I'm really good at saying no. But not everybody is, right? But see, the problem for many of us is when it comes to please, we're more manipulative than authentic. We are trying to manipulate the situation to get what we want without thinking of anybody else. Daniel's not doing that. Daniel actually, we're going to get to this in just a minute, is trying to live up to his convictions, but is doing that in light of thinking of other people. So if we're going to say please in a way that's helpful and beneficial to our relationships, it needs to be authentic and not manipulative. We know, that whenever someone is trying to manipulate you, or you're trying to manipulate the circumstances or a situation, things never turn out well in the relationship, right? Have you ever been in a relationship with someone who's manipulative? You don't want to do anything for that person because you always feel like they're trying to pull one over on you, right? Daniel shows us that our pleas must be authentic and not manipulative. He shows us something else too. Your pleas must be specific and not generic. I love that how specific Daniel was in his request. Remember, he specified the specific diet that he wanted to eat, vegetables and water. And then he specified the specific amount of time that he wanted to do this little experiment, 10 days. I think too often when we ask for something, we might use the word please, but we haven't necessarily thought about exactly what it is that we're asking for. We just sort of like, can you please do this? I think about it in terms of people who ask me, can you please pray for me? Please pray for me. Yeah, sure, I'll pray for you. That's not very helpful. It's a lot more helpful for someone to say, hey, could you please pray for me? I have a difficult conversation that I have to have on Thursday at 1 o'clock. Can you please pray for me because I'm going to the doctor on Tuesday and I don't know what they're going to tell me? Could you please pray for me because I'm really working hard to try and forgive my mom and I'm just struggling with that? See, there's something about being specific that helps with the please. So kids, when you're talking to your parents, be real specific about what it is that you're asking for, right? But our please needs to be specific and not generic. There's something that increases the power of that word when we're specific about what it is that we're asking for. Here's another guideline from Daniel. Your pleas must be timely and not random. I love that Daniel's not a procrastinator. Like he gets to Babylon and he gets recruited for this little program, but he doesn't wait until he's 12 months into the program before he raises his hand and says, could I have an exception? He asks right at the beginning. He's timely with his requests. I think a lot of times we know that there's an ask that we need to make, but we let fear keep us from asking it when we know we need to ask it. We let fear keep us from saying the thing that we know we need to say. But Daniel shows us how important a timely please is. I love what Solomon says in Proverbs. He says this, everyone enjoys a fitting reply. It is wonderful to say the right thing at the right time. We know that, right? It's so wonderful to say the right thing at the right time. But the opposite is also true. If we say the wrong thing at the wrong time, we've all been there, right? Things don't work out well. So your pleas must be timely and not random. And then here's the last one. Your pleas must be personal, but not self-centered. I think Daniel's request was personal in two ways. The first way is this. Daniel was making this request for him and his 3 friends who just happened to be stuck in the same group with him. He wasn't making this request for every other Jewish exile that had been recruited into Nebuchadnezzar's little training program, which I find very interesting because think about it for a minute. All these guys that were recruited into Nebuchadnezzar's training program were all Jewish. And you know what that meant? They all were supposed to abide by these same dietary guidelines. But the only one who seems to have the conviction to do something about it, to stand up for what's important to him seems to be Daniel, which I think tells us a lot about Daniel and his relationship with God and how important it is to him. And if you read through the rest of the book of Daniel, you see that not just in Daniel, but in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see how their relationship with God was so important, that their conviction about their relationship with God was so important, it made a difference in every part of their life. But Daniel's request was personal. He's not saying, hey, can you do this to all 300 of us that you chose for this program? I don't know how many were chosen for the program, but I'm assuming 300. Let's just, can you do this for all of us? No. He just says, can you do it just for a few of us right here? Me and these guys that just got stuck with me. Can you do that with us? It was personal for him. But it was personal, even though his request was personal, it wasn't self-centered. Think about it for a minute. Daniel made his request with the chief of staff and the attendant in mind. And I say that because he knew that both the attendant and the chief of staff could lose their lives if Daniel and his friends started to look worse than everybody else. He knew that the attendant and the chief of staff could lose their head if things didn't work out for Daniel and his friends. And so his request took that into account. That's why he said, hey, just test us for 10 days. Try it out for 10 days. He was thinking of them. His ask included the good of the one he was asking. See, I think when we make a request with please, most of the time, if we're honest, we're just thinking about ourselves. But if we're going to use please in a way that can leverage the power of that word, we need to be thinking about the one that we are asking more than we're thinking about what it is that we want. It reminds me of what Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2. He says this, don't be selfish. Thanks, Paul. Don't try and impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. I think this right here is really what the word please is all about. It's what makes please such a powerful word, because it allows us to put ourselves in a mindset where we are thinking of others first. And for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus, just a reminder, our faith is supposed to be others-centered. We're supposed to be thinking of other people before we think of ourselves. We're supposed to be seeking others' good before we think of ourselves. That's why one of the best marriage advice pieces that I've ever been given, and one that I share with anybody that I'm doing premarital counseling with, is like in a marriage, it's not 50-50, it's 100-100, but the 100 you're giving to the other person, you're not expecting 100 in return, and vice versa. You just give because you're trying to think of the other person first. That is at the core of our faith. That's the example that Jesus set for us, right? That he offered all of himself for all of us, thinking about us first, way more than he was thinking about himself. See, since we have such an others-focused faith, please is really the word that we can use to kind of reposition ourselves to start thinking of the other person more than we're thinking of ourselves. I think for many of us, we know what it's like to ask for something and to say please when we're just thinking about what we want. But what if we were to learn to ask with the other person in mind? What might that look like? I think that's what this word, please, is all about. So, just a little review. Your please should be authentic, specific, timely, and personal. And so here's what I want you to do with that. Will you please say please this week? It's as simple as that. Will you please say please this week? If you're a boss and you're having to say something to some of your employees, instead of demanding, why don't you say please? If you're a parent and you're giving some instructions to your children, could you please pick up your shoes and not leave them by the door on the mat so that I trip over them every time I walk out the door? Instead of pick up your shoes. If you're a kid, now for the kids in the room, this is going to be a challenge. I'm asking you to do something grown up. why don't you try and think about mom and dad as you're making your request? If you're out and about, how can you incorporate please into your regular conversations when you go to a restaurant, when you're at the grocery store or whatever? What if we, just us as part of the Hub City family, started to use this word on such a regular basis that other people felt valued and thought of because of how we use the word please? Let's close our eyes. I just want you to think back over your conversations that maybe you've had over this past week. And specifically, I want you to think back over the things that you've asked for this week. And I just want you to do a little self-evaluation of how you asked. Did you use the word please? Was your please authentic or was it manipulative? Was it specific or general? Was it timely or random? Was it personal or self-centered? And then I want to encourage you to just maybe pray this simple prayer. God, would you help me to think of others before myself whenever I'm asking for something from others? Help me to think of others before myself whenever I am asking something from others. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this story. There's so much in this story that I just love, but I just love the example that Daniel sets for us about how we can use this very powerful word. And I know that we're taught, even as we're kids, to say please before we ask everything. But we don't just want to say please in order to get what it is that we want. We want to say please in a way that's honoring to you. We want to be a people that thinks of others before ourselves. And so I ask that you would do the work you need to do in us to make us others focused. And that even though our lives are filled with asking for things and requesting things from other people, that we would do it differently. That we would not be demanding and that we would not be manipulative and that we would not be selfish in how we approach those times. But that we would think of others. That is my prayer for us. And that this word please would remind us this week of how we are to be others first and others focused in how we go through life. I ask that you would do that in me and all of us. We love you and thank you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.